Welcome everybody. This is our talk, Test Strategy Made Simple, or as we like to think of it, the Test Strategy Keynote. So my name's Hetty Borman-Weston, and I'm going to be speaking for the first few minutes about my experience of testing from the perspective of a Salesforce implementation consultant. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague, Geraint Waters. Geraint has a depth of experience in software delivery and in test automation, and he'll be talking in more depth about the components of an effective test strategy. So Geraint and I are both from a company called Provar, and we have a test automation product for Salesforce. We think that test automation is an important part of a good agile test strategy. We're going to be talking more about this later, but you can also visit us stand in the expo if you want to know more. I know it's the last day, but you still have 4 hours before the expo closes. So this is a required slide. Suffice to say, Geraint and I are not qualified to make any forward-looking statements about Salesforce, and we will not be doing so. So before we start, I want to make a point about why we test by telling a true story. So a membership organization had a Force.com membership management solution, and they added some email automation to it. Now that included some renewal reminders for when memberships were going to expire. So this was deployed successfully, but after go live, there was a routine data update that triggered thousands of emails to members that had been deceased for several years, with many of their emails going to next of kin. I think this story is important because it demonstrates that testing is not just about saving money by fixing bugs that have a monetary cost. It's also about using Salesforce to engage, to build trust with your customers and the importance of that relationship with your customers. Now, testing is really an essential part of making that engagement and that trust successful. So how do we deliver good testing? Well, traditionally, a project delivery might look like this. As you guys probably know, this pattern of delivery is called Waterfall. And it's so named for the way that you progress through different phases, closing off each one before starting the next. And then at the end of that comes testing. Now, typically, waterfall projects work best where the problem that the software is intended to solve is fully knowable and clearly defined. Salesforce projects generally don't meet that criteria. And I haven't often seen this in use on Salesforce projects, but when I have, I think there's two main drawbacks. The first is that the client doesn't get to see working software until quite late in the process. And the second is that it becomes difficult to make changes the further along that you get. On the other hand, there is a certain benefit for testers, which is that the solution has been documented extensively. So to some extent, it's quite clear what needs to be tested. Now, I think this is more reflective of how we work now. Agile, as you know, is a software development philosophy. It focuses more on short cycles of delivery, with all development activities happening simultaneously. Now, there are a number of Agile methodologies. One popular one is Scrum. So this just focuses on having regular communication between team members, short, frequent meetings. There's also Kanban, which often focuses around having a Kanban board. On this board, it would hold the tasks that have been agreed on for an iteration. Team members would typically choose their tasks, and then they would move them along the board into different state columns as they work to show their progress. We sometimes use a Kanban board within Scrum. It's often a way of communicating progress to people from outside the team. And I know there are many different types of Agile, but this Scrum and Kanban approach is one that we often see on Salesforce delivery. Now, Agile has several benefits, and I'm going to pick out two that have a real impact on testers. Number one is that there is an emphasis on face-to-face communication over extensive documentation. Now, in Agile, we see documentation as the least effective form of communication. And we focus on having that face-to-face communication in order to improve your collaboration and improve the quality of your work. This does have an impact on testers because they need to adjust to not having the extensive documentation that you would typically see on a waterfall project. The second important point, I think, is around embracing change. Now, in Agile, we see change as a potential strategic advantage if it can be implemented. So instead of having such fixed requirements as you would see in Waterfall, we see requirements more as a prioritized stack of work that can change. This is great for flexibility of delivery, And it makes clients happy because our solutions are more valuable and perceived to be more relevant, especially on long-term projects where change may naturally happen within a business. It can make things a bit more difficult for testers because they do need to be very flexible and they need to adapt in order to be successful in that environment. Now, we think that Agile is a good fit for Salesforce in particular, and there are a few reasons for this. One is that Agile embraces change, as I said, and Salesforce does the same. It has many declarative options. It's easy to make changes with many point-and-click features. And often these can be quite low impact on the rest of the system. So one example would be moving fields around on a page layout. It could break things, but it's relatively low impact. Another benefit is that Agile encourages iterative cycles where you show working software very early on in the process. Now, Salesforce also makes this naturally quite easy because it comes pre-configured. So as a consultant, I've used sometimes a new Salesforce org kind of as a demo tool in requirements gathering sessions. I find this can be quite helpful to explain key concepts, and it can also provoke discussion when people are seeing rather than being told. So there's a benefit for business owners, and there's also a benefit for Agile teams because it allows them to see and understand the full implementation. And finally, I think Agile also fosters adoption by embracing change and working closely with the business, for example, using product owners as advocates. Salesforce is only effective when it is widely adopted within the user group. And so it's important that the implementation demonstrates that value to users and the relevancy of the solution that you're delivering. Agile helps us support this effort. So what does Agile working mean for testers? Well, I believe there's still a role for dedicated testers on an Agile project. There are several reasons for this, but for me, the main one is that when I work with testers, I see them as a second pair of eyes. They're working slightly apart from the development team. And this is important because in Agile, we're constantly trying to balance between what is easy to use versus what's easy to deliver. And the development team naturally can be more focused on what is easy to deliver. So I think in order to bring that balance to the team, you need to have somebody who is a customer advocate and who can understand ease of use as well. And testers provide that focus. Now, these are the activities that we would expect testers to be involved in on an Agile project. It's perhaps a broader range of tasks than those on a Waterfall project. Potentially, there's more variety. It could also be more challenging. In my experience, the testers who embrace this variety are also the ones that provide the best value to you as testers. So, what can go wrong on a Salesforce project? One thing I see is that when we have more than one team working in the same org, this can be very difficult for a tester to manage. Ideally, we'd like to see these developments separated out into different environments. Another one is admins making updates directly in production. I think we are all probably guilty of that as admins. Hands up if you've ever made a direct update in production. Okay. If you're an admin and you didn't put your hand up, I think you're probably lying. This is one of those things that's really easy to do and quite tempting because it's easy, but it can cause chaos for alignments of your environments and also for the sanity of your testers. So relevant to my next point, not having a controlled process for deploying. Salesforce deployments can be fiddly and manual, and it can be difficult to track not just what needs to be done, but also what's done and who by. Also related to this is not having a regular cycle for refreshes and deployments. If your deployments are manual, it can lead to failures, and mistakes from this can seriously affect your testing and also waste time for your testers. And so finally, one special mention, Salesforce Permissions. Salesforce has an extraordinary number and variety of features relating to permissions, so what users can see and do within the system. I've put some of them up on this slide, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. In general, what needs to be tested does depend on your specific implementation and also on your processes. But in general, it's important to just make sure that you are testing your different permission layers, whatever those layers may be. This could be making time to test on different profiles. So something that's very tempting to do is to just test with your system admin. It's important to test with the others as well. Something else is if you have a private sharing model with sharing rules, it's important to test the different layers of that, so paying special attention to your roles and your sharing. So before I hand over, I just wanted to mention one final interesting challenge I found with the Salesforce platform, and that's regression testing. Now, Salesforce is a really scalable platform, and as I said, it's easy to make changes. But this also creates a problem for testers. So how can we keep up with the speed of delivery in Agile when we test? Testing is naturally a time-consuming activity when it's done well, and speeding it up does tend to reduce its quality. In addition, the size of regression testing to be done also increases over time, and this is what you see illustrated on the chart on the slide. Now, test automation can be a part of a solution for reducing this manual testing effort, and Geraint will discuss this a little bit in more depth later on. But ultimately, it's important to maximize whatever tools and resources you have to do the best testing you can in the most efficient way. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Geraint Waters, to talk a little bit more about building your test strategy.
Thank you, Hetty. As you can see, I'm going to talk about some methodologies, also manual testing, and finish off with sort of test automation. I think the first thing I just wanted to say is just really about high-level objectives. Probably this is a list I've compiled, but the reality is we as testers should be on Agile projects testing as early as possible, also as often as possible. And the other thing to really bear in mind is, I don't think on Agile we've got the luxury to test, everything exhaustively anymore. We have to just do enough for our situation, and understanding that situation is important. And also, as Hetty was mentioning around documentation, I think we can't afford to have verbose documentation anymore, again, because of this pressure of our sprint cycles. And also, I think key to this is making sure our customers are involved, making sure that we can take that mantle to keep communicating with them. So, and the other thing really, that's sort of, again, my understanding of Agile really is that quality is everyone's responsibility, and that's where we sort of grappling with this concept of where the QA fits into this. But I think when you've got this type of situation where you've got different factors in how we plan our testing, all of a sudden, I just don't believe you can have everybody does QA and everyone does development. I think you do need to have, in these circumstances, an independent testing team. So, very good one, and I think it's very prevalent in the Salesforce space, is the regulatory compliance. I mean, this is mandated that you have documentation. It's mandated that this is auditable. Also, when you have a situation, and again, this can be politically mandated, is that things are outsourced. So how can you sort of rely on the Agile methodology to communicate rather than document? So you have to be able to provide information to this outside team. And so this is a real factor in the way we run things. And also, I'd say complex domains. So what I mean by complex domains is when the information is, medical records and really sort of information that just cannot go wrong. And then we really need to think about how to make sure that these certain key, absolutely critical tests are done every time and not just thrown to one side because we're trying to get a sprint finished. And sort of the other one for me would be technical environment. So my experience has been that if you have a complex environment, maybe you have your own implementation, but then maybe you've got SAP, maybe you've got other Oracle applications upstream and downstream of you. How can you just have a sprint process? Because you need to fit into this end-to-end testing cycle and prove the product not just works within Salesforce, but works end-to-end. So I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about methodologies now. So with regards to common methodologies, this is, I think, more of a unit testing thing, but I think it's important we understand its importance within our space. I think the TDD approach really is where we have developers writing or failing tests before they write any code. And then the process really is that they will go through and write the minimum amount of code to make that test pass. So it's sort of getting things working nice and quick, which is great. But then the point is now as we refactor that code, we refactor it for maintainability, we refactor it for performance, and then we're going to break that passing test, for example, and then we'll go through and make it pass again. So this cycle gives us a bit more confidence to, again, get things written and get things documented at that level. The next thing which I think is important is, behavioral-driven development. I'm sure people have heard about the concept, but the reality is it's something that's prevalent in the Agile space, and it's really about documenting the behavior of the system. I think the important part of that is it's written as a team, and I think that really aims to be getting everybody up to understanding how this system is supposed to function, how it's supposed to be delivered, and every part of that, developers, BAs, QA, all buy into that. I think the key thing as well is it is written in a form of functional test. So really it's a case of we can read our test and understand what the system's supposed to do, and it's the why behind the code. So not a lot of people are doing this. And I think if you start seeing the language like given, when, then, I think that's where you'll sort of understand that people are trying to do this approach to try and have a formula to how we describe our functionality. The other thing I think is important when we're considering our test strategy, of course, is the environment strategy. And if we don't get this right, I think people can waste not days, we're talking weeks on a project. Again, coming back to no change in direction in production, I think it is going to cause problems. It is going to cause major issues if these things are, you are signing off for a particular release and then you find out that actually there's some major changes that's happened and it affects what you're signing off. The change management process, I mean, some people probably think this is a process for just production. I think it's in every environment. Of course, what we need to have from a testing perspective is reliance that our environment's fit for purpose. And we can't have a situation where people in the development team, for example, are just diving in and making their updates, and we're not even aware. The other point here is strict refresh cycle. I think the refresh cycles are important, and I've come across lots of clients of ours where you're just testing against an environment that hasn't been refreshed for a number of months. Now, that's maybe okay, but the reality is it's hard for the tester because sometimes you rely on certain data being there, and then maybe when you get a refresh, all of a sudden all this carnage has happened, things start failing, and it's because a customer's been made inactive in the production environment, and then all of a sudden there's different behaviors happening. So I think it's important to have that refresh quite mandated. It could be it's a weekly refresh cycle, a monthly, but as long as everybody understands that. Also, the separate testing environments. So again, we have to plan out our environments to make sure from a testing quality assurance perspective, we don't have people developing them, and also the system integration. So again, it's very, very common that we have many projects, many programs all happening in a single org. When that happens, what we're developing separately in different orgs, but then if we don't bring those streams together early, we'll just find our defects when we start treading on each other's toes later. So the sooner we can actually have these system integration environments, bringing in the programs together, the sooner we're going to realize where we're going to find out. If we find that out later in the program, that's a big problem. And finally, I think the key thing is for replica environments. So again, when it gets more complex, you will find that, of course, production has all these upstream and downstream applications, lots of integrations. If you don't mimic them, how do we know they're working? And again, if you mimic them in the last minute, the pre-prod, the staging, just before you get there, you're going to find out major issues very late in the process, and it's going to start affecting your date. So if we can ideally get every environment looking the same, then brilliant. I mean, why not? It's worth investing in. The other technique, I think, is everyone's probably heard of again, but I think let's try and think about it from a testing perspective, is DevOps. That's where we're automating our development operations process. So it is a set of processes that really just says, we want to do our development, we want to test it, and we want to deploy it. And I think the key sort of concept for me is we want to do it all the time. I mean, if we can actually get to a position where we're just constantly building into our test environments every night, and every night we run all of our tests, then it just means that there's just no time wasting around, one, doing it incorrectly because we've done it very manually, but two, just sort of getting into that cycle and having faith. And I think tends to be the senior management start to get the mails that come out of that and feel very big confidence that we're in a good shape. And I think the other final point on that is really just, you should really do it as soon as you can, because eventually we will do it. I mean, most people are on that path already, thinking about, and they're starting to think about the tooling around that as well. So let's come back to manual. There is a very, very important place for manual testing. I've read a number of things you can read about people saying, is manual testing dead? And clearly it's not. I mean, the point is that we need to rely on manual testing for usability testing. We need to rely on looking through and having a brain at the end of this thing, reflecting our customers' views. Equally, in an agile process, there's absolutely no way I would be trying to immediately automate new features. I mean, we should be looking at the requirements of the BDD descriptions of our test and applying our brain to them and saying, well, does it meet that? And if you start to immediately start putting in these rigid flows that have got exact data each time going through it, then of course we're going to miss things. User acceptance testing, I'd say, these things over time can be automated, but equally I think it's usually the user. So of course the user should be sort of doing that final checking potentially on important systems. Let's make sure that those features are still there. And finally, exploratory testing. I think exploratory testing is something we use a lot internally within Provar, and I think it's a really nice technique. So Again, I think if you haven't tried it, it's worth reading up upon it. This is a flavour of it now. I think it tends to be that you would create a test charter. That would be where you just sort of decide upon an important part of the system that you're going to attack, I think is probably the way I'd think about it. What I like about it is it's like a time-boxed approach. So you can do this type of thing as a team. You sit down and you say, right, the next 90 minutes, we're going to test the system. And I think it's important you switch off your mobile phones, you shut down your inboxes, so you focus. So everything for that 90 minutes is just testing the system. Now, there's no documentation traditionally around that other than the charter that says you're going to be taking a flavour of tests. And I think what happens then is you have out-of-the-box thinking. You're going to be sort of looking at it with a different, fresh set of eyes. Rather than trying to read some horrible Excel sheet, sort of mandating the next step, you're just going to be breaking the system or potentially just proving the system. So I think typically what you do at the end of that 90 minutes is you would reconvene, you talk to someone within your team and discuss how the importance of the issues, and then obviously at the end of that 90 you would be raising issues if you think they're important enough. So it's a very interesting thing, and I think it's allowing testing to be a bit more exciting again and a bit more less prescriptive. So I'm going to move on to test automation. I think it's essential for Agile, to be honest. I think the key thing is, again, if you try and fill into a 1 week, 2 week sprint, how are we going to test a complex application with lots of regression testing in 2 weeks? It's impossible. So we have to invest in this layer of testing. I think the first thing I would think about is, well, what tests would I want to even have in scope for this? So clearly the process you could follow from a test strategy point of view is, I quite like to use mind maps. So mind maps would just be a way of brainstorming, really, to say, okay, here's an area of the system. What is it that needs to be covered here? And I think you can continue to maintain that mind map. And again, I think it delivers against the low documentation mandate. Now, the ones I would be choosing, of course, are the ones that are difficult to perform manually. They would be part of the scope. That's where you might have hidden fields. That's where you might have system fields that need to be checked. And also, you need to consider, well, there's certain permutations sometimes that you need to run your software on different hardware, different software. And again, that's pretty boring if you're doing that manually. So I would want to automate them. The other thing we've got is just generally, long integration tests and, those type of end-to-end tests are quite time-consuming. They could be logging in and out of systems, doing different things, and for me, I'd be trying to include that in my automation. Now, once you've decided the scope and you say, yes, I've got a number of test cases, these are the ones that are important to me, I think it's important that we prioritize them. And an approach you could use is a risk-based testing process. So if you look at this sort of grid here, you've got on one axis, how likely is it that this will occur in your system? And then on the other axis, you've got sort of how nasty would it be to your business if it did happen? And obviously, you would be attacking the top right-hand corner first. So if you can prioritize it once you've got the scope of tests you want to do in this fashion, it really then allows you to determine what scope you've got for iteration. Because again, we want to be making this regression process obvious in our iterations if we're working in an agile fashion. Bite off what you think you can chew, deliver it as part of the sprint, and then next sprint you'll be taking the next sort of set of priorities. This next sort of set of slides is really going to talk about Salesforce. Salesforce, when we come to automate it, has some challenges. It's not your normal website. If you had a website and you'd written it yourself, you would make it a lot more testable and a lot easier to test. So it's out of your hands, and on that basis, you are going to have to choose how to test this. So what we've got here, for example, is we've got our UI testing. And when we look at testing a UI, we'll talk about, let's say, for example, a Salesforce layout. Typically, with some of these record playback tools, they just grab the ID of fields. Now, if you look at the ID of some of those fields, you'll sometimes see a Salesforce ID, which is the sort of long character you can see here. Now, that's absolutely fine, but the problem is, over time, you want to run your test automation in more than one org, and also you will refresh orgs, like we've talked about. So the issue there is that ID is not guaranteed to still be that ID when you move from SIT to UAT. So it's an invitation for test automation, because tests will fail. Equally, what we've got is dynamic IDs in the Salesforce space. So this is a typical ID you might see in a Visualforce page. Now, the issue here is, again, if you make no changes to your system, that will be perfectly fine to use. Now, the problem is, in an agile sense, we are forever making small changes to our apex. And if that's the case, you'll notice these numbers start going up or down. And again, your tests start failing. So you need to consider this up front, that this is not a reliable way of testing those pages. And obviously, the last one is an example of an XPath. And that XPath is pretty brittle. And you just make the smallest changes to different parts of your system, and it can't be used. But I've seen this many, many, many times. So it is worth just sort of considering up front, that's bad practice, and how do we solve that? Console testing, if people are involved in that, I think is harder than the usual Sales Cloud testing, and there's a reason for that. When you look at the screen, there are the different tabs that we need to manage. Now, technically, those tabs are frames, and in automation, you need to swap frames. You need to tell, I'm working on this frame now under the covers. Those frames have technical names as well. So it's something that a lot of people fail when they're trying to do console testing. Also, what's very interesting in console testing is you're usually working with lists of data. That data, as you can sort of see here, is what you can't afford to do is say, I want to have, for example, the case number 1333. I'm going to go straight for it with a locator for that field. And of course, there's going to be some data arriving tomorrow. That means that's in a different location. So we do need to map this correctly as a table to find the individual row first and then start interacting with that row and do something with it. In addition, the sort of challenges here, we've got the navigation menu. It's quite a tricky little object to derive. And also, I think what I find with console testing is that you've got the existing tabs. So if it's a very sticky experience, if you log out, log back in, you tend to see open tabs there from the last time you were using it. And again, from an automation standpoint, that actually can mean inconsistent results. The other thing that's the sort of bane of anyone who's done UI testing's existence is really about unreliable tests to do with timing issues. So in the Salesforce space, again, you do have either Salesforce itself with console or the applications built on top of it, such as the third-party App Exchange apps, use a lot of sort of frames again. And what you find there is fields don't all load together. So, again, you will find one test runs today and it fails tomorrow, and it's irritating. The second approach to sort of UI testing would be background processes. This is where you might have dependent pick lists. And again, if you're running too fast for the application you're running, it just means failing tests. And then finally, we've got asynchronous updates. That's where we've got, maybe we call out to big machines or another application that's part of the flow. And again, that could take 5 seconds. That can take 3 minutes. You can't dictate that. And the thing from an automation standpoint, which you'll see too much, is people putting direct sleeps into their test. And if you put a sleep in and it will take 10 seconds, then next week it took 2 minutes. You'll end up increasing your sleep to 2 minutes. And the obvious end effect of this is your tests are just really slow. And they're very sort of irritating that your whole pack takes a long time. Finally, Lightning. Now, my guess is people are now taking Lightning a lot more seriously with the sort of Winter 17 release. I think the key thing about that, it is based on open source language. It is completely different to test than Classic. And the IDs problem, if you do go and enjoy inspecting web pages, you'll see a similar problem to the Visual Force problem, where you've got these dynamic IDs that I wouldn't rely upon. Now, I think the word of caution, I guess, would be if you're building up a large amount of Classic test cases now, what are you going to do when you switch them over? Because it's like testing a new application. And I think it's a sort of real serious consideration. And obviously, we're going to have new problems as well with regards to custom Lightning components as well. So if we decided, brilliant, we want to do the automation, which I think in many cases people think is mandatory, I think the key thing now is, well, what are our factors from my own perspective? What does my organization need? And the things I would be looking at is the existing skills of the test team. So the test team themselves, you might have just an army of manual testers. So you're going to want to have a strategy that's going to move them into sort of filling the automation space. Equally, you could have developers, so you're open to other philosophies. I think the security of test data is important. So I mentioned earlier, we've got certain industries, such as the regulatory sort of governed industries. You can't have a test tool that's actually storing your test data in its own cloud version of its product. And that would be another problem where you have to go through the security team, and it's going to be an issue for you. And also, you might have end-to-end requirements. That actually means you can't test your internet, your databases. I think in addition to that, you can think about your technical requirements, which browsers are in scope, which devices are in scope, and also your integration requirements. So that's, again, you might have a sort of team governing that you need to be running these via Jenkins, via Bamboo. These are this continuous integration applications. You need to consider that. And also what end-to-end testing is actually in scope for your testing. That test tool clearly needs to be covering that type of technology, or potentially you might want to start uploading your data into ALM, that type of thing. And finally, the obvious thing to do is plan a proof of concept so that we can actually understand exactly whether it's fitting our sort of requirements. So here's your options, I'd say, from an automation standpoint. I think the first option is you can go with a custom framework. I'd say it's very, very, very popular in the Salesforce space. I think it's open source and it's low upfront cost, and you consider that. I think the issue with it is difficult to scale. So It is quite a big investment to build a framework, and then as you add developers to it, you will end up with many, many lines, or thousands of lines of Java code. Now, to me, my mind, it seems slightly counterintuitive that you go with Salesforce for the no-code option, and then you add an awful lot of code right at the end of the stack. But it is definitely an option. I think it is something you just be maintained by developers. I think the vendor tools that we got out there they've got very rich feature sets, and they've been out there for an awful lot of time. They do the things that you would probably need of a test tool. The hard thing for Salesforce, as some of the challenges already mentioned, very hard for them to keep up with Salesforce. So the 3 releases that come out will bring out new features, and the issue is that you're going to be wanting to taking advantage of those few features, and the tools typically won't really support everything you need them to do. So it does lead to potentially a bit of a low velocity around your testing, hard to maintain, and they can be brittle tests. Now, this was sort of the landscape, and it hasn't changed for a number of years, really, and that's what's prompted us to sort of talk about Provar next, which is essentially our solution to this. As an application, it is no code, so it does lend itself to the manual testers can be trained to start using the tool. It uses metadata, which is what makes it intelligent. That's why we can prevent these sort of brittle locators for your tool. And it is a console expert. So again, one of the hardest things about it is testing it, moving between the tabs. It just sort of does it intuitively, and you really don't need to understand anything about the frames underneath. And finally, lightning ready. So our test would be able to actually test classic pages, and also because we're leveraging metadata, it understands how that is represented in order and on the lightning side. I think the different features we've got is point and click. So again, a very drag and drop, that type of thing with regards to our test cases. Run securely within your network, so it is something that's installed on your Mac, your PC, and that really means that your data is not going off-site, and it is within your firewall to do end-to-end testing. You can also do UI and API steps in the same test. I think this is vital. I think when we think of automation, sometimes we only think we're testing the UI, the browser, but actually you can do an awful lot of good stuff at the API level, creating seed data sub-second, very, very quick. We also have the APIs built in and functions built in that allows you to do data manipulation and unique IDs as you'd need, and also integrate with DevOps strategy. And finally, end-to-end testing, so that you can support things like database testing, web services, email. Very, very common in the Salesforce space is I want to check my email has an attachment, and that attachment's correct. So finally, we're just rounding up. I think essentially we've got the benefits. From our point of view, we are being used on some of the largest Salesforce implementations, more the enterprise client, but also the ISVs. It is being used in the regulatory space to sort of produce the documentation that you would need that we're sort of saying we don't have time for. And also it supports many app exchange products as well, which are sort of quite prevalent in this space. And finally, yeah, like Cathy said, we've got 4 hours left, probably 3 hours now. Very welcome to come down. We'll obviously expand on that. And finally, we give a free proof of concept to anyone who's interested in the tool. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed Dreamforce. Is there any questions?
Would you be posting the presentation on channel?
Yes, I can do that. I mean, I think they also, in my knowledge, is they will be all going on YouTube over time, but we can do that. Yeah.
Are the tests created, do they become Apex tests like you would see in your, like we would traditionally have used?
Yeah, no, so the tests themselves are XML. So there doesn't have an underlying programming language, because a lot of the test tools out there will have a situation where as soon as it doesn't quite do what you want, you write a VB script or Java. But in our case, they are genuinely delivering as an XML, so they don't translate to Apex. The tool does support Execute Anonymous and things like Bulk API and SOQL, but that's within our API set ourselves, which are all drag and drop. So you can run Apex snippets and also create your own custom code if you want to create APIs within those, like an open framework to create your own.
So do they contribute to code coverage?
No.
How does your tool handle a lot of custom Visual Force data? We have those.
I mean, it's sort of what we do the most, really, is that people have implemented an awful lot of Visual Force. The issue with testing Visual Force is that you might have complex locators, and we provide those locators. And in the case of Visual Force, we actually use the Apex definition from metadata in order to calculate the IDs. So we calculate that J_ID, as you saw. But also it supports complex or AngularJS that sort of might be even contained within your Visual Force. Any other questions? Yeah, no, so basically we're obviously waiting for the sort of components themselves to mature, but actually we've been chatting to the metadata team from Salesforce in order to get certain IDs within those components, and it's going to make it an awful lot easier to test. So yes, we have a framework that's already testing certain Lightning components, but we'll be adding, as they come along, we'll be adding the sort of most common ones as default in the tool, but also helping people or profile users to add their own definitions. Yeah.
Does Crowbar actually test data transformations, migration integrations in one system into Salesforce?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, we integrate with Excel, that type of thing. So it could be a situation where you're loading it into System A, and then you wanted to test exactly that data and a translation into Salesforce. And again, we support a lot of the assertions, and we do it in a smart way. So it means you don't always have to do it even via the UI. You can do it at the API level and the database level. So yeah.
What is the installation? Is it individual installation or is it?
Yeah, so it's a desktop tool, which is again important that we don't have this sort of server component. So it just means that we can install it exactly on your laptop or your virtual server or your Mac, and it just works locally. But you would then have your test cases, the XML test cases, that ultimately you would then support into your version control system and share within the team as well. Because we have the callable tests that need to be given, and that allows us to have units of work that can be reused between testers.
So how do you then challenge with the global team? If you have a global team, if I'm running tests on my machine or creating tests on my machine, so how does my...
So yeah, the way it would work, I mean, if you're using Git, for example, you would be checking in every night, and then everyone would see your test, and they would pull down that definition, and they could amend it and keep it together. But you use your existing version control system to share that. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. Instead of Lightning, we are using Squid.
Okay.
Have you tried your framework using Squid on top of Salesforce?
We've been testing Squid already. It didn't at all.
Okay.
Hi. There's one at the back.
Can I run it using in my CI pipeline if I'm running your test, but I don't want it to run on a browser? So basically, can it run headless? Because if I want to integrate with my CI pipeline.
So you're talking about running headless?
Yes.
Yeah, so we support Phantom.js. Okay. I appreciate it. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for the questions.